everyone, Ramble-y here. So this is my first time making an actual YouTube video where I speak. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to do this because I've got ADHD. I tend to ramble and sometimes I completely miss the point that I was trying to make. But I had something I wanted to talk about today, and I think I don't know if it's important, but I think it is a good subject to discuss because, I want to know if other people feel the same way I do, especially if you're an artist or a musician. And pardon the background noise, I live in the Big Apple, and, there's a lot of noise up here, and we can't really change that. So what I wanted to discuss today is the different difficulties of being a multifaceted artist. So there's a saying that we all know, jack of all trades, master of none. And I honestly feel like I fit in that category. It's like I love doing a ton of different things just because it keeps me stimulated. Sounds like the wrong word, but we'll just use that one. Like it keeps me vibing, keeps me bumping. But people don't like that, especially when you choose to do that rather than sticking with one thing, especially as an artist. I think it can happen to anyone, honestly, anybody in any art field, but you see this especially with musicians. Like, it's already hard enough to jump from one artistic discipline to another. It's even worse just jumping from one music genre to another. It's insane. So the reason why I wanted to talk about this today is because I am a musician. I'm a professional singer, and that's what I do most of the time when I'm trying to get paid to eat or something. I also go to school, so I'm finishing that out, which is why I'm kind of laying low on work right now. But things are starting to amp up for me again, and I'm finding myself in a space to where I might be forced to choose between things that I want to do just on a vocal musical basis. So I studied classical voice when I was in both undergrad and graduate school. So, the whole trajectory was just woo, opera. I'm sorry, that was really rude. But yeah, my trajectory was opera, classical voice. I don't know what to call it. But being from New Orleans, I of course had some experience with jazz. I mean, I am the child of a jazz musician, so it was kind of inevitable that I would go down that route. During my time in undergrad, I was doing a lot of classical, but on the side, I was also doing jazz gigs just because, I learned how to do it and I like doing it. And it's like a cultural thing for me, so I really, I feel a certain way about it. However, I did not like what the classical world had to offer. I love people in it. I love the stories. I love the shows, some of them, especially the ones that aren't problematic, but that's another topic for another day. But the environment in general, no matter where you are, because a lot of people, especially people of color or BIPOC, they tend to complain about, how it's very Eurocentric or very Western centric, and oftentimes you do run into like issues of racism, and and then there's like gender inequality, and all the usual things that you see in any kind of work field or workforce. And that was not great. I did experience that to some level, luckily not to the level that some other people I have known have experienced it, but I've seen it, kind of felt it. And usually I felt it on the other end because I always felt like I was tokenized in certain spaces. However, I have also had experience in virtually all Black, not even all just BIPOC, all Black classical spaces. And even those didn't feel, I don't want to say safe, Well, they didn't feel quite safe, and they didn't feel as welcoming as you would think they would either. And I'm sorry if anybody in the classical world who I know was watching this, I love you, you're not the problem. It's more of an institutional thing, and that's the reason why I chose not to take like a full stop classical career path. Also, besides the whole issue of the institution and like, you know, the strange things dealing with bigotry and whatnot, I also had an issue with the fact that although I was in a program, especially like in my graduate years, I was in a program that allowed crossover between classical and specifically musical theater for us, but you can basically jump one genre to the next just because musical theater is comprised of many different musical styles. But regardless of this crossover, there was still some kind of vibe or this unspoken, I don't want to call it an unspoken rule, but it was an unspoken kind of thing that even though they allowed us to have these cross-genre, cross-disciplinary experiences, because, you know, we had to dance, even as classical majors, we had to act. I mean, that's kind of obvious because if you're going to be an opera singer, you do have to know how to act. I mean, and we were allowed to take other courses that allowed us to explore, you know, stuff like pop, rock, I think even jazz, but I don't really recall if that was a thing. Regardless, even though they allowed us to explore a lot of that, I felt like a lot of the professors and even some of the students contributed to this idea that you have to commit to the classical. It's like you can do all the other things on the side, but if you're going to be a singer, you have to be a certain type of singer. So either you were going to be committed to the classical track, you're going to be committed to the MT track. And of course, with MT, musical theater, you've got plenty of different genres you can sift through. But the problem with musical theater is that they tend to typecast you. So oftentimes, even if you want to do more, you're more times than not going to be doing more of the same rather than having a broader scope of options. Although that's not entirely true. I will say that a lot more people lately I've seen, they've been bouncing from one like type of musical, like let's say operetta style kind of musical, to like pop and rock or hip hop. Like I've seen people go from, let's say like Camelot to Hamilton. So it's not to say that they're as stringent. I will say that you have a little more freedom in the musical theater world, but I feel like just in general, in the classical space, I felt like they really wanted you to commit to the classical bit and just allow the other stuff to, you know, be little hobbies that you do on like a random Tuesday once every 5 months. And then on top of that, like I said, the industry is kind of screwed to begin with. And it's not just a matter of, you know, all the things we discussed before when it comes to issues with gender, race, whatever is in between all of that. There's also this issue of elitism and classism in opera. And like I said, even in the BIPOC spaces, there was still this level of like, oh, I'm just so much more enlightened. I'm so much more educated and poised than the rest of you lowly folk, the rest of you lowly peasants, you know, like, and it was not always like that, but I feel like the general space or the general environment throughout all the spaces that I've been through in the classical world, they've always been like this. Like, just generally. I don't mean to generalize, but if we're just going over the broad scope of things, they've always been like this. And even though I've seen people trying to change this, there's still so many other people that subscribe to this very, for lack of a better term, to this very elitist disposition when it comes to classical voice. I mean, and it happens in the instrumental world too. That's not quite my world. I've dipped in it, but I've not dipped in it enough to know, but I know people in it, and it's kind of the same thing. And so that's what kind of, even though I still enjoy singing opera today, I sing it in my shower, I sing it in my room when I'm bored or something. All of these things kind of deterred me from pursuing anything further. Like I wasn't gonna go on a Kathleen battle track because I was just like, this isn't quite for me. I love it. I love the people, or some of the people. I love the artistry. I love the artistry around it. But this environment is not healthy for me. So I decided to just, I'ma just skirt on by. And my teacher, she was perfectly fine with it. Like, she's a bona fide classical singer. However, she's also kind of a cross-genre person. She doesn't really sing many different genres per se, but she was a musical theater person before she became an opera singer. So she kind of understood where I was coming from. And, you know, I'm still in touch with her to this day. And, you know, we've talked about a lot of these things before, and she agrees that the environment could be better. Like, she still participates because this is kind of her livelihood besides being a vocal professor or vocal coach. But she understands my perspective on why I didn't particularly feel attached to staying in this operatic classical space. So moving on, right now, although I sing classically sometimes if it pays, I do now sing jazz more frequently. That is kind of the new shtick now, and jazz is great. Jazz, you have a lot of flexibility, and I feel like you meet a lot of great people. I specifically sing traditional jazz. I mean, I sing all types of jazz, but the thing that I'm really attached to is traditional jazz, which is obviously the jazz that came straight out of New Orleans in the 1900s, 1910s, 20s, 1920s. But yeah, that's kind of my shtick because, again, it's more of like a cultural attachment for me, and I just love it. And I really think, like, yeah, it's a really great vibe for the most part. You meet really great people, really great players, really great other, like I've met a lot of other great singers and whatnot during this time while I've been exploring this more. But even they've got problems. And that's not to say traditional jazz necessarily has problems. Traditional jazz is in a special place because it's dying. And even though people play it, they're forced to play other things because it's not as ubiquitous as it was, let's say, like, I would say 30 years ago, but I think even 30 years ago it was kind of on the struggle bus. We'll say 100 years ago because that's kind of the reality of it. Traditional jazz is it's a very particular sound, and only very particular people jive with it. And I'm one of those people. And there are also a good handful of people in the world that also get down to it too. But generally it's not something that people really have a taste for because it's old. And it's not exactly opera status to where it can get that level of like recognition. Jazz, or at least traditional jazz, does not have the same like elitist or hierarchical status that opera or the classical genre has. Although they try, there are plenty of people who try to like bring jazz up to, at least traditional jazz, to this new like elitist kind of level, just because a lot of the people who enjoy it are old people, and a lot of these old people who tend to enjoy it tend to be well-to-do old people. And I love them to death. Most of them. The ones who aren't, you know, kind of like stuck in that Jim Crow era. You know what I mean. But because of this, because traditional jazz is such an acquired taste, a lot of these jazz musicians have to play other forms, or like a lot of them have to play different forms of jazz because that's the only thing that's going to get the bread on the table. I mean, I could say that for my own father. I mean, although he primarily plays traditional jazz because he's awarded that luxury because he lives in New Orleans, and you know, that's kind of our shtick. And he's in a space that's particularly made for sharing that kind of jazz. He's also had times where he's had to play more modern jazz or even like R&B or something else, and he enjoys all of that. But again, that just goes to show that, you know, he can't quite live like the classical folk do, so therefore traditional jazz isn't quite in the same sphere that classical music is in. But when we're speaking of jazz as a whole, which I, again, as a singer and a singer who likes to be versatile, you know, I'm gonna sing any kind of jazz that I need to at any given time so I can eat. In the jazz world, you may know plenty of people like this. There are plenty of artists that are relatively big within this genre that definitely have this kind of attitude. Some maybe not, but you have a good few who do. And if you're watching this and you're one of these people, please fix it, because this attitude is just exhausting. You're acting like the very people who shunned our art form way back when. But anyways, the people I'm talking about are the people who like to proclaim themselves as the gatekeepers. And I don't mean cultural gatekeepers. That's one thing. These are people who want you to come, again, like the classical world, they want you to commit to jazz. Like if you play anything outside of jazz or you perform anything outside of jazz, they're gonna look at you cross-eyed. I'm like, y'all are behaving exactly like the classical folk who are like, it's cute that you do other things, but like, you should really stick to classical. I think that's safe. I think that's better. And I'm just like, why? Honestly, if we're going to be quite frank, it's much better to be a versatile musician because you're more likely to get more jobs, for one, because you can play more than one thing. And also, I think it's just healthy for your brain and it's healthy for your expression. I think just sticking to one thing sometimes, even though people... It's like, yes, I understand, like, you want to hone in a certain craft. But also, for me, like I said, for my brain, I have to do more than one thing. Because if I don't, I will go crazy. And I do not mean that in like the diminutive way. My issue just in the arts world is that we're always forced to choose, whether that's a genre in music or a whole artistic discipline itself. It's so frustrating because honestly, I think you get more out of doing more. And sure, sometimes you do want to focus on one thing at a time because you don't want to like tire yourself out. That I understand because I've burnt out several times trying to do multiple things at once. Totally get that. But I would like to be an artist that can not only sing whatever the heck I want to be able to express myself artistically any way I want. So if that means I want to paint, let me paint. If that means I want to dance, let me frickin' dance. And speaking specifically about singing, if I want to sing opera, I'll sing opera. If I want to sing jazz, I'll sing jazz. But if I also want to sing death metal, I'm going to sing death metal. And I shouldn't be shunned by a community just because I'm dipping my toe in every door possible. And that's what I feel is happening. And I guess it's always happened, but it's still happening and it shouldn't be because we are in this grand modern era where people are doing whatever they want. And I know I can do whatever I want, but again, it's like there's a price. It's like if I want to do the things I would like to do, I risk being blockaded by the gatekeepers within all of these different spaces. To give an example, I went to a party. I'm not going to say what kind of party because I don't even want to deal with that. I went to a party for professionals, and this was specifically for music professionals. I'm not going to say how I felt about it particularly, because if I do, I'm gonna hurt feelings and I'm probably gonna put myself in a weird spot. But at this party, I was speaking to a bunch of different artists. You know, some of them are cool, some of them, they're all right. And one person I particularly spoke with, she was very nice. She was very cool. I'm not exactly in touch with her. She told me to keep in touch, but I'm like, I take that with a grain of salt because half these people don't even think about you like 2 seconds after they speak with you, even if you see them again. But when we were talking, you know, we realized that we had a very similar career trajectory. We both went to the same school, and we both started out classical, ended up kind of doing more jazz post-grad. And the thing she told me was, you have to stick to one thing. She was like, oh, you've got to stick with jazz. Because if you don't, the jazz dudes or the jazz gals, they won't respect you otherwise. And I was like, dang, maybe I should take that to heart. But then in the back of my head, I was just like, should I care? I mean, I guess if I want a career, I guess I should, but I felt some type of way after that. I'm gonna be real. I was just like, and if they're gonna look down on me for being well-rounded, why should I give them any monicum of thought? And you know, this is kind of just stayed on my mind since that point. It's just something that loops through my head, and it's something that's looped through my head before because, you know, I mean, just as people, a lot of us go through different kinds of crises, and we all have a phase of imposter syndrome. That phase has kind of been lifelong for me just because of my own particular issues. But it's like, this isn't going to fix my imposter syndrome by allowing people to dictate what I should and shouldn't do to be in the in crowd. That's just going to make it worse. I've worked so hard these past few years trying to come out of that mindset because I've always had imposter syndrome, like I said before, and it's not been fun. And it's made the art making that I've been trying to do not fun. And I know it's kind of my job, but I also want to have some level of fun when I'm working, especially when it's something I enjoy. Like if this were just a regular 9 to 5, okay, I gotta do what I gotta do. But this is something that I deliberately set out to do. And particularly for me, I studied music because I just wanted to study music. I didn't want to study any one particular type of music. I was just forced to because of the circumstances of what the programs I was in offered. But I came to learn. And whatever the capacity of that learning was, that was all I was there for. That's all I wanted. So, to me, this whole thing about, you know, forcing yourself in this one direction so other people can feel comfortable with themselves, I guess that's why they're doing it, because other people are like, oh, I worked all my life doing this, and how dare you? Like, I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know what goes through the heads of people who have this very gatekeepy, very, there's another word for this. I forget. I don't know. It's kind of gatekeepy. It's very, it's like one-track minded. But I personally don't know what is going through these kinds of people's heads. You know, I'm not going to speak for them. But from what I can assume and what I gather from my experiences with these people, I'm guessing they feel some type of way when they see a lot of us, you know, philandering around with all these different things, and they've sold their souls to become like the next Charlie Parkers or Robert Glaspers. Actually, Glasper is not a good example because that man is multifaceted. So, but other than that, there are like plenty of people who sell their souls to, you know, get really good at a certain thing. And you know, that's great for you. I love that for you. I can't function like that personally. I'm like a person who needs like a variety on my plate rather than one thing. I need the Ethiopian platter, okay? I need the lamb tips, I need the lentils, I need the fish goulash, the collard greens. I need all of that. I can't just have one because my brain is always moving. And there are a lot of people like that. I've met plenty of other people who function like this. So it's not just me. But we shouldn't be punished for being like this. And honestly, you know, sometimes I think it's like, you know, to each his own. I'm not going to say prescribe anything to anybody, but personally, I think that it is good to have a good number of interests because you don't limit yourself. Because, you know, what happens to people that fulfill that one thing they always wanted? More times than not, they end up, oh shucks, what do I do now? And then they have existential crises. And then a lot of stuff goes on. And then, you know, I don't know what happens after that. Sometimes good things, sometimes meh. I've already had all that. I've had the existential crises. I've had the imposter syndrome. I've had the whole montage of things because I've had to grapple with this contention between my way of being and the system. And I'm like, I'm not going to force my circular self into a triangular space. Not going to do it. Because every time I've tried, it's not done me justice. And honestly, I don't think it's doing other people who are in my position, and I think even people who don't even realize they're in my position, justice. And, you know, I think that's kind of the crux of my whole video. So if I ranted too much, I'm sorry. I'm just, you know, this is something I'd be feeling. So if you have any experiences like this, or if you feel the opposite of what I'm discussing, let me know. I'm curious because I never know where people are at, and I'm not exactly the most people person because I'm very introverted. I know it doesn't look like it right here, but you know, sometimes it's just easier to talk to the void rather than talking to somebody, especially when you're very socially anxious. But I am curious about other people's perspectives on this. Let me know how it is, and until then, see ya.